This has been a great collaborative opportunity for us to work not only with the Musée Picasso in Paris, but also with our partners in Seattle and San Francisco to bring this exhibition to Virginia at this moment. Seattle was very important to us. They built out the indemnity campaign for this exhibition. Of course, the values of this exhibition are absolutely astronomical, and only with federal indemnity could we afford to bring this exhibition to the USA, and Seattle were instrumental in doing that. And so it is very appropriate that our speaker tonight should be from Seattle, the chief curator there, Chiyo Ishikawa. The official title is the Susan Brotman Deputy Director for Art and Curator of European Painting and Sculpture. She leads the Seattle Art Museum's curatorial department, overseeing the permanent collection and the artistic programs. Dr. Ishikawa joined the Seattle Art Museum in 1990, having served as an NEA curatorial intern in the Department of European Painting at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and in the Department of Paintings Conservation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She was also a Theodore Rousseau Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and her PhD in art history came from Bryn Mawr College. Among exhibitions, she has curated a Spain in the Age of Exploration, 1492 to 1819, Leonardo Lives, the Codex Leicester, and Leonardo da Vinci's Legacy of Art and Science, and A Willful Innocence, Victorian Prints and Photographs. Her book on a work of art from the Spanish Royal Collection, The Retablo of Isabel la Católica by Juan de Flandes and Michael Cito, was published in 2004 and won the Eleanor Tufts Book Award from the American Society for Hispanic Art. She was awarded the Spanish Order of Isabel la Católica in 2004 for her work on Spain in the Age of Exploration. So it is very fitting that Chiyo Ishikawa should be our speaker tonight on another great native of Spain, and of course, I speak of the great master of 20th century art, Pablo Picasso. Please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Chiyo Ishikawa.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Robin. Good evening, everybody. I'm so happy to be here and to be part of the opening festivities for this incredible exhibition. This is my first visit to Richmond, and I've known this museum through its reputation for many years, but it's been a real treat to get to see the building, the new building, the incredible collections, meet the wonderful staff, and who have all made me feel so welcome here. So I'm delighted to be here with you tonight, and I'm going to talk for the next 45 minutes or so in a very simple, straightforward, and general way about this incredible exhibition, which some of you have already enjoyed. I hope you'll enjoy it many times because it's a show that really must be seen more than once. 175 works from the Musée Picasso, which is the most important collection of Picasso's work anywhere, and yet it's one of the least known. So while you'll have many surprises in store, one of the things that I think will astound you is just this nonstop quality and impressiveness. So the Musée Picasso came about after Picasso's death. He had not left a will, and the French government reached an agreement with his heirs, his 5 heirs, that the cream of his vast personal collection would go to the French state, and in turn they wouldn't have to pay inheritance taxes. This became the core of the Musée Picasso. And it certainly fulfills a dream of Picasso's because he was somebody who was so self-conscious, so aware of his own importance to art history, and he was holding works back from the market that meant a lot to him personally, and also because he knew that they were major artistic milestones. So as you go through this exhibition, which runs from the very beginning of his career at the beginning of the 20th century and ends up just a year before he dies in 1973, you really get a history of 3/4 of the 20th century. You also get an incredible story of his personal life, which is one of the more colorful biographies that you can imagine, as we'll get a little sense of tonight. So why don't we get started? Pablo Picasso was born in 1881 in Malaga, a city in southern Spain, and his father was an artist, not the kind of artist that Picasso would become. He was an academic painter. He taught in various art academies, and his own personal specialty was the painting of pigeons. And as a young boy, Picasso would help him finish paintings, painting certain details on the pigeons' bodies, and also was from a very early age showing an incredible artistic aptitude. Any of you who have visited the Museo Picasso in Barcelona will have seen some of those early childhood drawings that are just so accomplished. So his talent was recognized from a very early age, and there's a famous story that Picasso, when he was about this age, his father came to him, turned over his brushes symbolically, saying, "You have surpassed me, and now I give you my brushes." Whether or not that actually happened, certainly symbolically, Picasso eclipsed his father from a very early moment. When he was only 19 years old and the family now was living in Barcelona, a painting of his, a large academic painting, this is the kind of thing he was making at that time, was selected to be shown in the Spanish pavilion at the 1900 World's Fair in Paris. So at the age of 19, Picasso went to Paris for the first time, and this was the first of many kind of transformative experiences for him. He encountered not only the great works that were in the Louvre, but also all of the works of the French avant-garde of the last 50 years. And think about it, he encountered them all at one time. So realism, impressionism, post-impressionism, symbolism, all of these great artists, Courbet, Manet, Monet, Cézanne, Degas, Gauguin, Van Gogh, all at the same time. And suddenly he knew that he needed to go into a different direction. Barcelona now seemed quite provincial by comparison. This painting that you see here, which looks monstrous on the screen but is really only about this big, is one of the first works that he painted after that, 1901, when Picasso was 20 years old. And it documents a terrible, violent incident that marks his early adulthood, and that is the death by suicide of his close friend Carlos Casagemas, who was also from Barcelona and who'd gone to Paris with him and fallen in love with a young French woman, but she eventually rebuffed his ardor, and he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head in a Paris restaurant in front of her and a whole bunch of friends who he had invited for the evening. Now, Picasso was not there. Picasso was in Spain at the time, but this was an event that haunted him for years, and he painted a number of works that show Casagemas's dead body. Very gruesome subject matter, but begins a kind of rumination on the kind of violence of passion that can be part of what accompanies the idea of love and romance, and also the sense here of violence to the human body. So we see this kind of pallor, green pallor of his dead friend, illuminated by this oversized candle, which doesn't really give comfort. It's more kind of this relentless light. And of course, the person that he's looking here when he's creating a work that has such an unsettling impact on us is Vincent van Gogh. When you see it in the gallery, you'll notice the thick impasto and these vivid colors right next to each other. And this is the first example of what Picasso would later say when he said, "When I paint, I feel that all the artists of the past are behind me." Well, until 1904, Picasso went back and forth between Barcelona and Paris. He finally settled in Paris in 1904. He said that the death of Casagemas plunged him into what we now know as the Blue Period, and we have some fantastic works in the exhibition that are emblems of that time. The print on the right, The Frugal Repast, is only the second print that Picasso made, and he came out with a masterpiece right from the start. It's one of the most famous prints of the 20th century, and it encapsulates that approach that he has during the Blue Period of focusing on people who are not carried along in the wave of prosperity, but who live outside of society, who don't have much money, who are sick, hungry, and maybe drink their dinner instead of eat their dinner. And so this kind of sad and sense of sadness and sense of pathos that these figures have is something that we associate very much with the Blue Period. On the left is one of the really masterpieces of this period, and you can see, looking at this painting, which is known as La Celestina, that this is not a character who appears helpless or pathetic in any way. She is wary and watchful and has a kind of cat-like quality that suggests she is in charge of her surroundings. This is actually a portrait of a person that Picasso knew very well in Barcelona. Whether he was in Paris or Barcelona during this time in his life, he was living in very seedy circumstances. And this was a woman who lived in his building, and she was a procuress. She could get you anything that you wanted or needed, whether it was legal or illegal. And this is Picasso's kind of woman. He was great friends with her and captured this quality that she has so arrestingly in this amazing portrait. One of the things that makes it so compelling, I think, is that she has that cataract over her eye. And surely this is part of how she looked. But there's also Anne Baldessari, when she was in Seattle, mentioned something that I hadn't known, which is that this woman was also considered to be a witch. And Picasso was very fascinated by a different kind of sight, one that is more clairvoyant and a kind of second sight, more intuitive. And these two things, the observation of the natural world and then this more intuitive response, are things that remain very much with him throughout his life. And we'll see this kind of oppositional way of treating eyes through the early part of the exhibition. In 1905 and 1906, he expands this subject matter a little bit and is still portraying characters who are outside of society, but now they're outside of society by choice rather than by circumstance. And this is the world of performers, circus performers, itinerant acrobats. There were some of these people who lived in Picasso's neighborhood in Montmartre, and he was fascinated by performance. So this beautiful painting on the right-hand side of the two brothers is about that moment. And you see these two brothers striding forward. You would think that they were emerging from classical Greek sculpture, if not for the drum and the begging bowl that sit off to the side, reminding you of what their actual day-to-day existence must be like. But they're rendered in this beautiful gouache with these lovely rosy tones, and there's a kind of greater sense of well-being at this moment, in this period that lasts quite a short time. One of the things that's so remarkable about this exhibition and this collection is that it makes a real case for Picasso as a sculptor, and I think that this is a side of Picasso that perhaps we're less familiar with. This is a rather conventional sculpture in terms of the way it's made. It's a bronze that was cast from plaster, but it's a wonderful example of him working in three dimensions. He's always thinking about the relationship between sculpture and painting when he works. This is a work that started out as a portrait of his friend Max Jacob, who was a poet. And then as he kept working on it, it evolved into something different. And this is something that Picasso recognized could happen again and again as he worked. He would start off with an idea, and then the subject or the work itself would take over and take him into a direction that he hadn't intended. Well, the Rose period lasts for a very short amount of time, and then just a few months after he's painted that painting, he turns in a different direction. Now, we've already seen that Picasso is capable of drawing like a dream. He paints like a wizard. He can do anything he wants, and yet at this moment, he decides that he is not going to take that easy path, which has won him a lot of important clients. He wants to challenge himself, and he will do this again and again throughout his career. That is, push back, fight against his own virtuosity, and try to get at something that for him feels more real, more raw, more crude, and sometimes really ugly. I want to talk first about the self-portrait on the left side. At this moment, really, Picasso decided that he would set an ambition for himself. He wanted to be the greatest modern artist. And think about the audacity of that claim. He's living in Paris, which is not his native town. He doesn't really speak very good French. He's surrounded by talented artists, and he makes this claim. And then how does he go about it? He doesn't follow the example of the Impressionists who make themselves modern by painting modern subject matter, or the changing urban scene, or the smokestacks of industrialization. His subject is very ordinary. It's a self-portrait. With Picasso, the subject is much less interesting than what he does with it. He always paints, or rather, conventional subjects. So here he's making a self-portrait. And the first thing he does is strip down. Anne Baldessari interprets this as he's naked. He's starting afresh, like Adam. And then, more importantly, what he does with his own form. He hammers that body flat like a piece of metal and pushes it against the surface of the painting. And then, although we can see that it's Picasso because of those staring eyes, he turns the face into kind of a stylized mask. He hasn't yet seen African sculpture. That will happen the following year, but he has this year seen an exhibition of prehistoric Iberian sculpture from his homeland, the Iberian Peninsula. And that is sculpture that is carved out of very hard stone, and it's carved in very shallow relief. So these kind of cipher-like signs for the facial features are what is inspiring him at this point. And then you see very quickly, just a few months later, he abstracts that even more to an almost cartoonish degree in this figure that you see on the right. And notice that opposition of the eyes that I mentioned earlier. Now, this is a study for a painting that became a kind of his manifesto at this moment, and a work that is the first great masterpiece of the 20th century, a work that's not in this exhibition, but I'll show it to you in just a moment. He, at this time, when he's still a bit of a struggling artist, buys an enormous piece of canvas and commits himself to making something that will be a statement. And then he makes over 1,000 studies for it. And this is just one of them. There are a number of works in the exhibition that are studies for this painting. And the painting, of course, is the Demoiselle d'Avignon. And again, you will not see it in the exhibition. But I wanted to show it to you because you can see what a radical step this is. And again, to think that just a few years previously, he was painting these, rather sentimental, beautiful, quiet, kind of passive works. And here he comes emerging with this crashing announcement of a new approach, where he has fractured the portrayal of the figures. He's turned the background into this glassy hall of mirrors. And then, most shockingly, he reflects a visit that he made that year to the Trocadero Museum, the ethnographic museum in Paris, where he first saw African masks. And so when the painting is almost done, he repaints two of the faces as these African masks. So not only do you have a shocking subject matter, 5 naked prostitutes displaying themselves in a kind of staring way to the viewer, you have an assault on the human form, and then you have this jarring juxtaposition of a new style on top of all of that. Well, Picasso kept that painting in his studio. He didn't show it publicly for 8 years, but many of his friends and artists, fellow artists, came to see it. His sophisticated patrons, Gertrude and Leo Stein, other collectors came to see it, and uniformly people thought it was just horrible. And today, of course, we recognize it as really this kind of shout that announces the new century and the new approach. Well, of course, what this will lead to is the movement that we now know as Cubism. And this all seems so inevitable to us, but of course we have to remember that Picasso didn't know he was going to invent Cubism. It was something that was a process of discovery and development in tandem with his close friend and colleague, Georges Braque. And I think in a way, the easiest way to think about Cubism is to look at these two drawings, which are shown side by side in the exhibition. Here is the study of a head of a woman from 1909. It actually portrays his companion from this time, Fernand Olivier, who you will see in the exhibition in portraits that are much more conventionally beautiful and flattering. And then we see, just from the next year, another head, and look how different they are. This one, while obviously distorted and kind of turning the head into a geological form, nevertheless retains its integrity as a solid form, and you can feel that head on the neck, and you can imagine a torso emerging from that. Whereas it's not so fixed and unmoving in the drawing on the right. You can make out this Spanish woman. You can make out her mantilla, her jangly earrings, her cheekbones, her eyes. But it doesn't sit still. It's as though you threw a stone at a mirror and everything kind of shifted and became these different facets. This is nothing less than a new way of thinking about how we look at things and how we render three-dimensional form on a flat surface. So if you think about looking as a sequence of minute moments rather than as taking everything in once and ending up with an entirety, if you think about, I look at your eyelash, your earlobe, your jawline, your nose, as this kind of series of discrete apprehensions, and then try to render that, this is what you get. It's counter to the way that artists had been working since the 15th century, with one-point perspective and everything sitting nice and straight, and the painting as a window into this other world. This is really about change and motion and flux, and they felt that it was a much more accurate way of painting the condition of life and art at this time. And it becomes fundamental to artists, and for many people, this is Picasso's singular contribution. Well, when it comes to paintings then, it can become quite complicated. The drawing that we just were looking at was still easy to see. Here we have images of two musicians. These were paintings that were commissioned by an American patron to adorn his library in his Brooklyn house. The commission never was completed, and Picasso held on to two of these works, even though they're unfinished, for the rest of his life, and they are the two major Cubist paintings in his collection. He said, when I paint a Cubist work, I try to give the visitor something that they or the viewer something that they recognize in order to buoy them up for the difficult parts. And I think when you look at the man with the guitar, you can make out parts of the instrument, the swell of the body, the neck of the guitar. You can see the head. You can kind of make out a profile. Living with the painting on the right, the man with the mandolin, we never found either the man or the mandolin. And you may have better luck. But the goal with these is not to find all of those recognizable parts and put it together so that it makes finally a recognizable thing that we feel comfortable with. That's not what it is. It's keeping you in this sense of suspension and making you work the way that Picasso and Braque worked as they were kind of finding their way to this expression. You'll notice also that these works have virtually no color. They've been drained of color, which I think would have been a distracting element. But very shortly after that, color is reintroduced through incorporation of bits and pieces of the real world. Braque is the first one who does it, and Picasso quickly follows suit, and that is introducing bits of wallpaper, bits of newspaper, so that art and life intermingle on, in this case, the piece of paper on the drawing. And so the new form collage is created, and they explore all of the possibilities that are involved with that, and continue to take this idea that art is no longer meant to replicate reality or duplicate reality. It is now something in and of itself. This kind of liberation of art from illusion is a very important part of Cubism. And once they've created the collage, and I should just also urge you, when you're in the great gallery here that is filled with graphic works, stop and look very closely at this work, because those pieces of wallpaper aren't actually glued to the surface. It's not really a proper collage. They're pinned with little straight pins. So it's a very subtle kind of sculpture, actually. And it was just a little sidestep to move into 3 dimensions as they're working with this idea of planes and shifting planes, to take it to 3 dimensions. And so this great violin from 1915 is also in the exhibition. He's taken flat pieces of metal and molded them, cut them and shaped them to create this accordion-like form, which he calls a violin. And then he's doing something that you also typically didn't do with sculpture at this time, and that's paint it. So he's blurring the boundaries between what we traditionally think of as painting and what we traditionally think of as sculpture. And I don't think it's because he is an iconoclast or wants to, angrily break the mold. I think it's really he just doesn't acknowledge that there are any rules about these things. And that generous spirit of openness is something that permeates the exhibition, makes it a wonderful show for children, and is an opportunity for us to open ourselves to his very open approach. So he had great success with Cubism. A whole following developed among a younger set of artists in Paris, who were then called collectively the Cubists by an art critic. And just at that moment when this kind of traction had been achieved, this is what Picasso does. He changes entirely. And part of it, there are many, many reasons for the transition, or the abrupt jump, I guess, between what we've just looked at and what we're looking at now. But one of them certainly is that Picasso never wanted to be part of a movement. He did not want to be seen as part of a group or tied to any kind of ideology. And in fact, once he had really, I guess, gone as far as he could with Cubism, there no longer is this kind of Darwinian evolution from one movement to another that we see in the first decade of the 20th century. Now everything is available to him, and we can no longer speak of a single style. There are different moments in his career, but he draws on everything from this point. One of the key events, too, of course, is World War I, and Georges Braque immediately enlisted and went to war. Picasso was a Spanish national, and he was also a lifelong pacifist, and he did not fight in World War I. Instead, he accepted the invitation of a Russian ballet impresario named Serge Diaghilev, who had the wonderful company, the Ballet Russe, and he invited Picasso to southern Italy with him and the troupe, where they were developing a new ballet, and Picasso was invited to design the costumes and the sets. And so this built on where he was going in Cubism anyway, reintroducing color in a greater decorative sense. And so I think that that's also behind this. Certainly, another important issue is that he fell in love with this young woman, Olga Koklova, who is a Russian ballerina. And in southern Italy, visiting classical sites, visiting the museum in Naples, painting, he stops painting before he's gotten that far. And as a result, she kind of hovers here in a sort of limbo forever. And notice also how he slightly distorted her figure and flattened out the surface of the chair, so it's not foreshortened, it actually flattens out and adheres to the picture plane. And then finally, he doesn't finish the painting. You're looking at the primed canvas all around the figure, and then the funny marks on either side of the figure are where he's dried his brushes. So she hovers like a decal or like a pinned butterfly to the surface and becomes a beautiful pattern, a beautiful shape. But I don't necessarily think of this as a portrait. I think of it as a painting. And for Picasso, he always said it's always about the problems of painting. And so the kind of detachment with which he can portray Olga may portend issues in their marriage, and we'll see about that in just a little bit. But in the meantime, there is this joyful expression, so rare in Picasso's work, a work of unbridled, unhampered physical exuberance. We almost never see him portraying movement. Certainly his involvement with the ballet and the dance must play a role here. But one of the things I love about this painting, which incidentally is also tiny, 16 inches wide, is that these women look like they weigh 450 pounds and are made of concrete, and I just can hear them boom, boom, boom as they run headlong along that concrete sand dune. This painting looks so great at this scale, and in fact it was later blown up to serve as the backdrop for a ballet performance a few years after it was painted. It's one of my favorite works in the collection. And it just reminds you that masterpiece doesn't always have to be as big as the Demoiselle d'Avignon. So Olga and Pablo had a son in 1921 who they named Paolo. And Picasso would eventually have 4 children, but this is the only child he had with Olga. And you can see that he's made this portrait of his son on the left a little bit on the model of the portrait of his wife, unfinished again. One of the things that I think is notable about this beautiful painting is that he outfits his son as a harlequin, and the harlequin was Pablo Picasso's own alter ego at the beginning of his career, and so he's imposing something of this kind of playful but also kind of a morally ambiguous persona on his little son. Now here is where you can see both that idea of working in multiple styles at any given time, and also again the incredible relationship between two-dimensional work and three-dimensional work. The painting on the right is a painter with palette and easel from 1928, a practically disembodied figure of which the most active parts are those 2 staring eyes that always are the sign for Picasso, and then that brush poised to make a mark on that rectangle of blank canvas. But notice how he takes that entire vocabulary and transposes it to a spatial configuration. This is one of 3 maquettes that Picasso made while thinking about a monument to his great friend Guillaume Apollinaire, who had died in 1918. And the artist's widow asked Picasso to design something for his grave. And he was thinking about something in Apollinaire's own writings in which he talked about the ideal monument, a monument made of nothing, like poetry or like fame. And so it's very much a conceptual sculpture. It's a sculpture you can see through. And it was way too abstract a concept for the artist's or the poet's widow, and so it never worked for that purpose. And so one work was eventually realized in large scale. It's now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But this is a fantastic work, and it's also shown next to another tremendous sculpture in the collection. And they have a relationship that I didn't recognize in our installation in Seattle. So this is the wonderful thing about this show and Picasso's work, is how things relate to each other in a constantly fluid way. Well, by this time, Picasso is very prosperous, very famous. He and his wife, as soon as they got married, moved to a very nice bourgeois apartment on the right bank, far from his kind of old bohemian haunts. And they had a very stable life. They dressed up and went to openings and premieres, and it was certainly a level of success that he had aspired to from the very beginning. But it also came to chafe on him very badly, and he missed his old bohemian life, and he missed his freedom. And when he walked down the street one day in 1927 and encountered a 17-year-old girl named Marie-Thérèse Walter, he introduced himself to her, said, "I am Picasso, and we will do wonderful things together, or great things together." And she said, "I don't know who you are. I don't know who Picasso is." And I think it was that, I mean, she was young, she was beautiful. She was also innocent of him and his reputation. And I think that that combination was extremely appealing to him at this moment of his life in his mid-40s. So they began a very intense and very deep love affair that lasted about 10 years. And he very quickly set her up and kind of developed an alternate life. He had his life with his wife and son, and then he had this little love nest with Marie-Thérèse, and you definitely have that sense when you look at the works that he devotes to her, which are one of the real high points of the Musée Picasso collection, and obviously works that meant a lot to him. These are works that are painted in utter admiration and love. He's simply besotted with her physical form. He sees her, as you can see in the painting on the left, as a series of interlocking circles, spheres, rounded forms, curving lines. Even the chair comes around and embraces her. There is something so cozy and comforting about this figure. He also then does an amazing series of sculptural works. He gets engaged with bronze sculpture again at this time, well, plaster modeling and then cast in bronze, that are all a sequence of meditations on her classical profile. And then a work like the one that you see on the left reminds me of another Picasso quote, which is that Marie-Thérèse will let me do anything I want. And just that sense of abandon and submission that you see in this ecstatic painting on the left, where she's cast as a nocturnal fertility goddess. Incidentally, a work that, though it doesn't look Cubist, is unthinkable without the precedent of Cubism, the way that you can see the front and back of the body simultaneously. And then he'll completely dehumanize her into this series of bones or driftwood or stone and still call it a woman in a chair. She unleashes a kind of inventiveness and a real ability to explore the same thing through many different expressions that really sustains him for a long time. In 1935, Maya gives birth to a baby girl, and the secret relationship, which he'd managed to keep a secret from his wife and from even his best friends, suddenly is known. And it also, of course, changes the dynamic of their relationship, which is really so based on sexual intimacy. And so it's about that time that he pursues a relationship with another woman named Dora Maar, who is, perhaps you can see just by looking at the painting on the left, Marie-Thérèse's opposite, where Marie-Thérèse is round and soft and passive and internalized. Dora Maar is brittle, angular, vividly colored, and alert, intelligent. She's very much a public figure, very different from this little cloistered, hermetic world that Marie-Thérèse is, that he has created for Marie-Thérèse, I should say. Dora Maar is a celebrated photographer. She's a very tough photographer. She shows with the surrealists, and she's part of a sophisticated intellectual circle. She's also a political activist. All of these things enlarge Picasso's world and stimulate him in a way that he seems to need right at this moment. And he portrays her numerous times. You can see, this is a photograph that she took in Picasso's studio, where you see his new obsession with her, and the fact that, as she herself observed, every time Picasso has a new mistress, he comes up with a new style for them. And for better or worse, she becomes the vehicle for him to express his grief and anger over the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. And he doesn't do it through himself. He uses her face and distorts her face in some of the most painful ways. I mean, these are some of the strongest and most gripping works in the exhibition. Make sure when you look at the painting on the right, The Weeping Woman, that you look at it close up and look at the surface, how he's scratched into the paint as though as she's scratching down her face. These are works that have a very physical evidence of his emotional investment in them. So Picasso had a tendency to go back and forth to Spain regularly until 1934, and then after 1936 he could not go back. It would be dangerous for him to go back. So he, although he felt very Spanish, never went back to Spain after 1934. So these are very difficult times for him. He said later it was the worst time of his life. The Spanish Civil War lasts from 36 to 39, and then it's immediately followed by World War II. And for somebody who had never considered himself politically even engaged. The world comes into his imagery now, but not in a predictable way. The painting on the left is very interesting because it reminds us that in addition to the very strong collection that the Musée Picasso has of works of art by Picasso, they also have an archive that contains 200,000 bits of his life. And Anne Baldessari used to, when she started at the museum, she was the curator of the archives, and so she has uncovered all kinds of interesting material. And she learned that this painting, which is dated August 30th, 1938, and this is typical for Picasso, he'll often include the date, not just the year. She found an article in the archives that he had cut out of the newspaper, reporting that 2 paintings by Vincent van Gogh had been burned by the Nazis as degenerate art. And of course, we all remember that Van Gogh was a huge model for Picasso at the very beginning of his career, somebody who he later called my father. And so he painted himself as Vincent van Gogh. And you see the straw hat, the red beard and hair, and then that kind of exaggerated brushwork that suggests that, that approach of Van Gogh, that very bold way of painting. And at the same time, he does a series of works, again based on the head of Dora Maar, though he also would admit that his Afghan hound was partly the model for this painting. That feels really good when you're Dora. But he, I think, is thinking about this idea that the Nazis are promoting of a way that art should be, and it's a very sentimental, kind of insipid model for art, and that is what art should be. And so these works I see as not only his continuous exploration of form, but also his own political statement that art can be what artists want it to be, and it can be ugly, and it's art because I say it's art. In a way, it's going back to his approach to Cubism. But we also see more conventional expressions of his outrage, such as this painting of a cat seizing a bird. This is another one that you have to look at very closely because he has clogged up some nasty stuff on the surface of the shoulder of the cat, and again made the painting itself kind of a physical repository of his emotions. And also during these war years, he creates some astounding sculpture. The sculpture on the right, the head of death, is a larger than life-size skull. For me, it always seems that it was less made than found. I picture it on an ancient battlefield, and it just is almost like an archaeological artifact. But he did make it, and he made it during the years when Germany was occupying Paris, and metal was all being taken for the German war effort, and yet his friends managed to save and scavenge bits of metal and give to him so that he could make this sculpture, which is, of course, a powerful anti-war statement if you see it in the context of the war. At the same time, he made this work in a much simpler way, the head of a bull, which simply is attaching bicycle handlebars to a bicycle seat and recognizing that they look like the most elegant and stylized head of a bull that you can imagine. The idea of something becoming something else is very important to Picasso throughout his life and his work, and metamorphosis is something that fuels so much of his work. He later said what he would love to happen with this work was that it would someday end up on a junk heap somewhere, and a boy would come along and find it and say, "Great, I've got handlebars for my bike and a seat for my bike," so that it would go back to its original function. After the war, Picasso spent pretty much the rest of his life in southern France in a succession of properties that he bought there. And the woman who accompanied him there was a young artist named Françoise Gillot, a painter. She's still alive. She's 89 years old. And she was a beauty and a real intellectual match for Picasso. I love this picture by Robert Capa. It's in the exhibition because it's one of the few times that you see Picasso in a submissive position. And he looks pretty happy. And their life together was very modest, but very full and rich on another level. They had 2 children together, Claude and Paloma. And Picasso is in his 70s, and this was a wonderful opportunity for him to kind of keep reconnecting with the child in him. You'll see through the exhibition quotes from him about his effort to maintain a young approach and not become hardened. And so you see him here drawing with his children. This playfulness that they inspire is also seen in works in the exhibition, like the famous goat, which he made out of objects that were around their home and studio. So a wicker basket for the body, a palm frond for the back, 2 ceramic bottles for the udders, and then he held it all together with plaster and then cast it in bronze. And then, as you can see here, this playful menagerie, as though they've all kind of walked out to take the sun on the front steps of one of his homes. He would form them in plaster, and then they would be cast at a foundry in bronze. So this was, for Picasso, a kind of idyllic world. For Françoise, it was less so. She was very devoted to him, but she felt that there was this constant effort to hamper her own development as an artist and as a person. And finally, after 10 years together, she left him and took the children with her back to Paris. And this is the painting that Picasso painted after she left. Now, we've already seen how he typically deflects his emotions to other creatures or people in his works of art, but here he shows himself at a moment of great vulnerability and loss. He described this to a friend as he opens the door to the bedroom that he and Françoise shared and is confronted with an image of everything that he's lost. Not only Françoise, embodied by the nude, but also that little horse and cart that you see up top was one of his children's toys. So he stands helpless, flat, no hands, and is just faced with this feeling of abandonment, which was one of the things that he feared more than anything. Of course, he wasn't alone for long. And there was a young woman named Jacqueline Roch who came into his life and ended up staying with him for the rest of his life and was a wonderful companion for him. She was, like most of the women in Picasso's life, very beautiful, but he did transform her appearance. She looked so statuesque in this beautiful painting on the right with her beautiful kind of Nefertiti eyes. But that impossibly long neck has nothing to do with her actual appearance. She was about 5 feet tall and very petite and tiny. But she made his life as easy as she could for the last 20 years of his life, and probably he had such a long life because of her good care. And the last works in the exhibition show an unflagging activity. And a refusal to shrink from the themes that have always fascinated him and obsessed him. And a lot of this later work was not well received when it was first shown. Critics felt that it was painted in a kind of slapdash manner, and they were a little put off that somebody this age was still painting works with such strong sexual themes. But this is part of a continuum for Picasso. Sexuality and creativity were so intertwined in his mind and in his work. And I think that one way to look at this late work is just that kind of sense of urgency, painting to stay alive. His output, as you know, was just tremendous, and I think part of that was this kind of race against time. He didn't really stop painting until about 5 months before he died, and he died at the age of 91 in 1973. So you will see in this incredible exhibition just the fruits of a life lived so productively and creatively. And I hope it's an inspiration for you in many different ways, but I'm happy for you that you get to live with this show for the next 3 months, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for your attention.
I'd like to thank Dr. Ishikawa for that wonderful introduction to the exhibition. For those of you who've seen it, I'm sure that adds another layer to your understanding. I think for all of us who've seen the exhibition, we feel it's something you have to see many, many times. So please go ahead and reserve additional viewings of the exhibition over the next coming months. Thank you so much for coming, and enjoy Picasso in Richmond. Good night.